The sound of concrete cracking echoed through the morning air like bones breaking. Marcus Chen stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, watching the HOA's demolition crew tear apart the retaining wall he'd built with his own hands. The sledgehammer struck again, and another chunk of reinforced concrete tumbled down the slope behind his house. "Stop!" Marcus shouted, bursting through his back door. "You don't understand what you're doing." The crew foreman, a burly man with paint-stained overalls, barely looked up from his work. "Sorry, buddy. Orders from the HOA board. This wall's gotta go." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched 3 years of backbreaking work crumble into rubble. The wall wasn't just concrete and steel. It was the only thing standing between his neighborhood and the unstable mountainside that had been slowly giving way for decades. Every geological survey, every engineering report, every sleepless night he'd spent calculating load-bearing requirements had led to this moment. And now, Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, was destroying it all because it didn't match her vision of mountain community aesthetics. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been living the quiet life he'd always dreamed of. After 20 years as a structural engineer in the city, he'd finally saved enough to buy his dream home, a modest 2-story house perched on the edge of Pine Ridge, where the morning fog rolled up from the valley like a gentle blessing. The commute to his consulting firm was longer now, but the peace more than compensated for the extra hour each way. His neighbors were the kind of people who waved from their driveways and invited him to backyard barbecues. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow next door, brought him homemade cookies and updates on local gossip. The Martinez family across the street had twin daughters who sold Girl Scout cookies with the tenacity of seasoned salespeople. Even the teenagers who skateboarded down the steep residential streets seemed respectful, always calling him Mr. Chen, and moving aside when his pickup truck rumbled past. The first sign of trouble came during his morning jog. Marcus had developed a routine of running the perimeter of the neighborhood, partly for exercise and partly out of professional habit. His engineer's eye couldn't help but notice the subtle signs of soil movement. The hairline cracks in sidewalks, the way certain houses seemed to settle just a little differently each season. That particular morning, he'd stopped at the end of Maple Street, where the road curved around a natural outcropping of granite. The mountainside rose steeply here, covered in a mixture of native pines and the kind of loose shale that made hiking dangerous after rainfall. Marcus crouched down, running his fingers along a fresh crack in the asphalt. The fissure was maybe 3 feet long, perfectly straight, running parallel to the slope. "Settling," he murmured to himself, but his professional instincts told him otherwise. This wasn't the gradual, predictable settling of new construction. This was the kind of crack that appeared when something big was moving underground. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began documenting what he saw: photographs of new cracks, measurements of existing ones, notes about drainage patterns and soil composition. His basement office filled with geological surveys, property records, and historical weather data. The picture that emerged was troubling. Pine Ridge sat on an ancient landslide zone, and the recent pattern of heavy spring rains followed by drought was destabilizing the entire slope. The solution, Marcus realized, was a properly engineered retaining wall. Not the decorative stone walls that dotted the neighborhood, but a serious structure designed to redirect water flow and provide lateral support to the unstable soil. He spent weeks calculating specifications, consulting with his former colleagues, and researching the best materials for the job. The wall he envisioned would be 6 feet high, built with steel-reinforced concrete, and anchored deep into the bedrock. It would run along the back of his property, where the slope was steepest, and extend partially onto the adjacent empty lot. The design was elegant in its simplicity, a curved structure that would blend with the natural contours of the hillside, while providing maximum structural integrity. Marcus submitted his plans to the city planning office and received approval within 2 weeks. The building inspector, a seasoned professional named Rodriguez, had looked over the specifications with genuine interest. "This is solid work," Rodriguez had said, flipping through the technical drawings. "You sure you're not in the construction business?" "Structural engineer," Marcus replied. "I've seen what happens when people try to build on unstable ground without proper support." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Yeah, we get landslides up here every few years, usually after the big rains. This wall of yours might just save some lives." The construction took 3 months. Marcus did most of the work himself, hiring a crew only for the concrete pour and the heaviest lifting. He worked evenings and weekends, his hands developing calluses that his office job had never required. The physical labor was satisfying in a way that computer modeling and client meetings never could be. Mrs. Patterson would bring him iced tea during the hottest afternoons, and the Martinez twins would sit on their bikes watching him work, asking endless questions about concrete and steel and why walls needed to be so thick. Other neighbors stopped by to chat, and Marcus found himself explaining the engineering principles behind his project with the enthusiasm of a teacher. "It's not just about holding back dirt," he would tell them. "It's about redirecting forces. The mountain wants to move downhill, that's just physics. But if you give it a path, if you channel those forces properly, you can work with nature instead of against it." The finished wall was beautiful. The curved concrete surface was stained a warm earth tone that complemented the natural stone of the mountainside. Marcus had incorporated planters along the top, where native grasses and wildflowers would eventually grow, softening the industrial lines of the structure. A small drainage channel ran along the base, carrying runoff away from the residential area toward the natural creek that meandered through the valley. For 2 years, the wall performed exactly as Marcus had designed it. During the record-breaking rains of the following spring, he watched from his bedroom window as water flowed harmlessly along the drainage channel, while the wall itself showed no signs of stress or movement. The investment of time and money had been worth it. Then Karen Whitmore moved into the neighborhood. Karen arrived like a storm system, bringing with her an agenda that would reshape Pine Ridge according to her vision of suburban perfection. She was a woman in her early 50s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from years of corporate management. Her husband had retired early from his tech company, and Karen had decided to dedicate her newfound free time to community improvement. Within 6 months of moving in, Karen had successfully campaigned for the HOA board presidency on a platform of preserving property values through architectural consistency. Her first act was to commission a comprehensive review of all existing structures in the neighborhood, with particular attention to anything that might be considered non-conforming to community standards. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official language that made Marcus's stomach clench. Notice of violation unapproved structural modification was printed in bold letters across the top, followed by 3 pages of legal jargon that essentially boiled down to one simple demand: tear down the retaining wall or face legal action. Marcus read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. According to Karen's interpretation of the HOA covenants, any structure over 4 feet in height required board approval before construction. The fact that Marcus had received city approval was irrelevant. The HOA had the final say over architectural decisions within the community. "This is insane," Marcus muttered, reaching for his phone to call his lawyer. The conversation with his attorney, Sarah Kim, was less encouraging than he'd hoped. Sarah had handled the legal work for his house purchase and was familiar with the HOA's governing documents. "I've seen this before," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd fought too many battles with homeowners associations. "The HOA covenants are pretty broad when it comes to architectural control. They can argue that your wall violates the aesthetic guidelines. But it's a safety issue, Marcus protested. The wall is preventing erosion and potential landslides. I have documentation, geological surveys, engineering reports. That may not matter, Sarah interrupted. The HOA has the legal authority to enforce architectural standards, even if those standards conflict with safety concerns. Your best bet is to appeal directly to the board and hope they'll listen to reason. Marcus spent the next week preparing his appeal. He compiled a comprehensive presentation that included geological data, engineering calculations, and historical records of landslides in the area. He created maps showing water flow patterns, soil composition charts, and computer models demonstrating the wall's effectiveness in preventing erosion. The HOA board meeting was held in the community center, a small building that doubled as a venue for neighborhood events and emergency meetings. Marcus arrived early, setting up his laptop and projector, organizing his charts and documents on the presentation table. He'd practiced his speech a dozen times, refining his arguments and anticipating potential objections. Karen entered the room 10 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, flanked by the other board members, Tom Bradley, a retired accountant who served as treasurer, Jennifer Walsh, a local real estate agent who handled community relations, and David Park, a young software developer who managed the HOA's digital communications. "Mr. Chen," Karen said, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that didn't quite mask underlying hostility. "I understand you wanted to address the board regarding your violation notice." "Yes. Thank you for hearing my appeal," Marcus replied, standing behind his presentation materials. "I'd like to explain why this retaining wall is essential for community safety." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus laid out his case with methodical precision. He showed them the geological surveys that identified Pine Ridge as a high-risk area for landslides. He explained how the wall's design redirected water flow and provided lateral support to the unstable slope. He presented historical data showing previous landslides in the area and demonstrated how his wall would prevent similar disasters. The board members listened with varying degrees of attention. David Park took notes on his tablet, occasionally asking technical questions about soil composition and drainage patterns. Jennifer Walsh seemed genuinely concerned about the safety implications, nodding as Marcus explained the potential risks to neighborhood properties. Karen, however, remained unmoved. She sat with her arms crossed, her expression growing more skeptical with each slide of Marcus's presentation. When he finished, she was the first to speak. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm for this project," she began, her tone suggesting anything but appreciation. "But the fact remains that you built a 6-foot concrete wall without board approval." The HOA covenants are very clear about architectural modifications. "But this isn't about architecture," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice level. "This is about preventing a natural disaster. The geological data shows that you're trying to use scare tactics to justify violating our community standards." Karen interrupted. "Pine Ridge has been here for 30 years without any major landslides. Your wall is an eyesore that damages property values and sets a precedent for other residents to ignore HOA regulations." Jennifer Walsh leaned forward, her realtor's instincts engaging. "Karen, if there's a genuine safety concern, shouldn't we consider—" "There's no genuine safety concern," Karen snapped. "Mr. Chen is an engineer who sees problems everywhere he looks. That's what engineers do. They create problems so they can solve them and feel important." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt his professional composure cracking, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've spent 20 years designing structures that protect people from natural disasters. I'm not trying to create problems, I'm trying to prevent them. This wall could save lives. What it's doing is violating our community's architectural integrity, Karen replied. The wall doesn't match the aesthetic guidelines established by this board. It's industrial, ugly, and completely inappropriate for a residential neighborhood. Tom Bradley, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. What if we required Mr. Chen to modify the wall's appearance? Maybe add some decorative elements or change the color? Marcus seized on the suggestion. I'd be happy to work with the board on aesthetic modifications. We could add stone facing, incorporate landscaping, whatever you think would be appropriate. No, Karen said firmly. The wall has to go. We can't make exceptions to our architectural standards, no matter how compelling the justification might seem. If we allow this, every resident in the neighborhood will think they can build whatever they want without board approval. The vote was 3-1 against Marcus's appeal, with only Jennifer Walsh supporting his position. Karen had swayed Tom Bradley and David Park with arguments about precedent and property values, dismissing the safety concerns as exaggerated. You have 30 days to remove the wall, Karen announced, her voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. If you don't comply, the HOA will hire a contractor to demolish it at your expense. Marcus left the meeting feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. 20 years of professional experience, comprehensive engineering analysis, and genuine concern for his neighbor's safety had been dismissed by a woman who cared more about aesthetic guidelines than human lives. Over the following weeks, Marcus tried every legal avenue he could think of. His lawyer filed an injunction seeking to prevent the demolition, but the judge ruled that the HOA had the legal authority to enforce architectural standards. A city inspector confirmed that the wall met all safety requirements, but city approval didn't override HOA covenants. Marcus even organized a petition among his neighbors, explaining the safety risks and asking for their support. Most signed willingly. They'd seen his presentation, understood the engineering principles, and trusted his professional judgment. Mrs. Patterson was one of the first to sign, her aged hands shaking slightly as she wrote her name. That wall has kept my basement dry for 2 years, she told Marcus. Before you built it, I had water coming through my foundation every spring. Now, I don't worry about the rains anymore. But the petition meant nothing to Karen. She dismissed it as mob rule and insisted that the HOA board's decision was final. As the 30-day deadline approached, Marcus made one final attempt to reach Karen directly. He showed up at her door on a Sunday morning, carrying a folder of photographs and documents. Mrs. Whitmore, I know we've had our differences, but I need you to look at these pictures, he said when she answered the door. Karen's expression was cold as winter steel. Mr. Chen, the board's decision is final. You've had 30 days to remove the wall voluntarily. Since you've chosen not to comply, we'll be sending a demolition crew tomorrow morning. Please, just look at these photos, Marcus pleaded, holding up images of previous landslides in the area. This is what happens when the mountain lets go. Houses destroyed, families displaced, lives lost. My wall is the only thing preventing this from happening to Pine Ridge. Karen glanced at the photos with the kind of dismissive attention she might give to a door-to-door salesman. Mr. Chen, I've lived in mountain communities my entire life. I know how to assess risks. Your wall is unnecessary, ugly, and a violation of our community standards. It's being removed tomorrow, and that's final. She closed the door in his face, leaving Marcus standing on her porch, with a folder full of evidence that no one in authority seemed willing to consider. The demolition crew arrived at 8 o'clock the next morning, just as Marcus was finishing his coffee. He watched from his kitchen window as they unloaded their equipment: sledgehammers, jackhammers, a small bulldozer for clearing away the debris. The foreman spoke briefly with Karen, who had come to oversee the destruction personally. "This is insane," Marcus muttered, grabbing his phone to call his lawyer one more time. "There's nothing we can do," Sarah told him, her voice heavy with regret. "You've exhausted all legal options. The HOA has the right to enforce its architectural standards, even if we disagree with their decision." Marcus ended the call and walked outside, hoping to make one final appeal to the demolition crew. But as he approached the work site, Karen intercepted him. "Mr. Chen, I need you to stay away from the work area," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "For safety reasons." Safety reasons. Marcus couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. "You're about to destroy the only thing keeping this neighborhood safe, and you're worried about safety." "I'm worried about you interfering with the demolition," Karen replied. "The crew has their orders, and I intend to see them carried out." Marcus watched helplessly as 3 years of work disappeared under the relentless assault of sledgehammers and jackhammers. Each blow felt personal, like watching someone destroy a piece of his soul. The wall he'd designed with such care, built with such precision, reduced to rubble and dust. By noon, it was over. The retaining wall was gone, leaving behind only a scar in the earth and a pile of broken concrete. The demolition crew loaded their equipment and drove away, leaving Marcus standing in his backyard, staring at the naked slope that rose behind his house. Karen approached him as he surveyed the damage, her expression suggesting satisfaction with a job well done. "I hope you understand that this was necessary," she said, her tone attempting diplomacy. "The HOA has to maintain standards. We can't allow individual residents to ignore architectural guidelines, no matter how well-intentioned they might be." Marcus turned to face her, his engineer's mind already calculating the consequences of what she'd just done. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to remember this conversation. When the mountain comes down, when people lose their homes, when lives are lost, remember that I tried to warn you." Karen's diplomatic facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Chen, you're being melodramatic. This is a stable neighborhood. Nothing's going to happen." "You're wrong," Marcus said quietly. "And we're about to find out just how wrong you are." The weather forecast called for rain. 3 days after the demolition, the first drops began to fall. Marcus stood at his bedroom window, watching dark clouds gather over the mountain peaks. The meteorologist on the morning news had been cautious, but clear a strong Pacific storm system was moving inland, bringing with it the possibility of heavy rainfall and flooding. By evening, the rain had intensified to a steady downpour. Marcus could hear it drumming against his roof, cascading from gutters, saturating the earth. He'd spent the afternoon waterproofing his basement and moving valuable items to higher ground. But his real concern wasn't for his own property. It was for the naked slope behind his house. Without the retaining wall to redirect water flow, the runoff was carving new channels in the loose soil. Marcus could see the erosion beginning even in the dim light from his porch, small gullies forming where none had existed before, rivulets of muddy water carrying away pieces of the mountainside. He called Jennifer Walsh, the only board member who had supported his position during the appeal. "Jennifer, it's Marcus Chen. I know it's late, but I need you to listen to me. The rain is destabilizing the slope behind my house. Without the wall, we're looking at a potential landslide situation." Jennifer's voice carried concern even through the phone's static. "How bad are we talking?" "Marcus, should I be worried about my house?" "It depends on how much rain we get and how long it lasts," Marcus replied, watching another small section of soil break away from the slope. "But if this storm continues for another day or two, we could have a major problem." "I'll call Karen and the other board members," Jennifer said, Maybe we can get an emergency meeting together. The emergency meeting never happened. Karen dismissed Marcus's concerns as panic-mongering and refused to convene the board for what she called unnecessary drama. The rain continued to fall. By the second day, Marcus's worst fears were beginning to materialize. The slope behind his house was showing clear signs of instability, visible cracks in the earth, small slides of loose rock and soil, and a constant seepage of muddy water that stained his lawn brown. He spent the day documenting the changes, taking photographs and measurements, calling city officials who promised to look into it, but seemed in no hurry to take action. The rain drummed on, relentless and indifferent to human concerns. Mrs. Patterson called around dinner time, her voice shaky with worry. "Marcus, dear, I'm getting water in my basement again. It's coming through the foundation, just like it used to before you built that wall." "I'll be right over," Marcus said, grabbing his emergency kit and a flashlight. Mrs. Patterson's basement was worse than he'd expected. Water was seeping through multiple cracks in the foundation, and the floor was already ankle-deep in muddy runoff. The elderly woman stood at the top of the stairs, wringing her hands and looking lost. "I don't understand what's happening," she said as Marcus waded through the water, checking for electrical hazards. The basement was fine for 2 years. "Why is this happening now?" Marcus helped her move her important belongings to the upper floors, his anger at Karen growing with each ruined family photograph, each waterlogged memento. This was exactly what he'd tried to prevent, not just property damage, but the heartbreak of watching a lifetime's worth of memories destroyed by preventable flooding. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to consider staying with relatives for a few days," Marcus said, as they carried the last of her photo albums upstairs. "This storm isn't over, and I'm concerned about what might happen if the rain continues." "You think it's going to get worse?" she asked, clutching a water-damaged picture of her late husband. Marcus looked out her kitchen window at the rain-soaked slope, where new cracks were appearing even as he watched. "Yes, I do, and I think you'll be safer somewhere else." The third day of rain brought a new level of urgency. Marcus woke to the sound of something crashing in his backyard. A section of the hillside had broken away, taking with it a mature pine tree that now lay across his patio furniture. The entire slope was becoming unstable, held together by nothing more than the roots of the remaining trees and the rapidly diminishing friction between soil layers. He called the city Emergency Management Office, the County Geological Survey, and even the State Department of Natural Resources. Each agency promised to investigate, but none seemed to grasp the immediate danger. Meanwhile, the rain continued to fall, and the mountain continued to weaken. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the HOA office in the community center, determined to make one final appeal to Karen. He found her in the main conference room, reviewing architectural plans for a new playground that the board was considering. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need 2 minutes of your time," Marcus said, water dripping from his rain jacket onto the polished floor. Karen looked up from her paperwork with obvious irritation. "Mr. Chen, I'm busy, and I thought we'd settled this matter." "The matter isn't settled," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of 3 days without sleep. "The slope is failing. I have photographic evidence of soil movement, foundation damage, and increasing instability. If this rain continues, we're going to have a landslide." Karen set down her pen and fixed him with a stare that could have frozen the rain outside. "Mr. Chen, you've been predicting disaster since the day you moved here. First it was erosion, then it was landslides. Now it's some kind of catastrophe. You're like a broken record, always forecasting doom and gloom." "I'm a structural engineer," Marcus said through clenched teeth. "It's my job to identify structural risks and recommend solutions. The wall I built was that solution, and you destroyed it." The wall was an eyesore that violated our community standards, Karen replied. And your constant fear-mongering is becoming disruptive to neighborhood morale. Maybe you should consider whether Pine Ridge is the right community for someone with your anxieties. The suggestion hit Marcus like a physical blow. After 3 days of watching his neighborhood deteriorate, after helping Mrs. Patterson salvage her flooded basement, after documenting the very real and immediate dangers that Karen continued to ignore, she was suggesting that he was the problem. Mrs. Whitmore, Marcus said quietly, I want you to remember this conversation. When the mountain comes down, when people lose their homes, when someone gets hurt, remember that I tried to warn you, and you told me to leave. Karen's expression didn't change. Mr. Chen, you're being melodramatic. This is a stable, well-established neighborhood. Nothing's going to happen. Marcus left the community center and drove home through streets that were beginning to flood. The storm drains, designed for normal rainfall, couldn't handle the volume of water pouring off the saturated hillsides. Muddy streams ran down residential streets, carrying debris and topsoil toward the valley below. That night, Marcus barely slept. He kept the lights on in his bedroom, watching the slope through his window, listening to the rain that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Around 3 a.m, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, a deep, rumbling groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. He grabbed his flashlight and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, lightning flashed, illuminating the hillside for a brief moment. And Marcus saw what he'd been dreading, a massive crack running horizontally across the slope, maybe 100 feet long, marking the boundary between stable ground and the section that was preparing to let go. The landslide began at 4:17 in the morning on Thursday, October 15th. Marcus was wide awake, having given up any pretense of sleep, when he heard the first sounds of catastrophe, a low rumble that built to a roar, like a freight train thundering down the mountain. He ran to his window and watched in horror as the entire slope behind his house began to move. Trees that had stood for decades toppled like matchsticks. Boulders the size of automobiles rolled down the hillside, gaining speed and momentum. And beneath it all, a river of mud and debris that swept away everything in its path. The slide followed the natural contours of the land, flowing around Marcus's house and continuing down the slope toward the community center. He watched in helpless fascination as the disaster he'd predicted played out exactly as his engineering calculations had foretold. The path of destruction was precise, predictable, and devastating. Marcus grabbed his phone and called 911. His voice barely audible over the thunderous roar of the landslide. "There's a landslide in progress at Pine Ridge," he shouted into the phone. "Multiple buildings are in danger. We need emergency response teams immediately." The dispatcher's voice was professional, but concerned. "Sir, are you in immediate danger? Do you need to evacuate?" Marcus looked out his window at the wall of mud and debris that was now approaching the community center. "I'm safe for now. But there's a building directly in the path of the slide. The Pine Ridge Community Center. People might be trapped." "Emergency crews are en route," the dispatcher replied. "Stay on the line and keep me updated on what you're seeing." Marcus watched in horrified fascination as the landslide reached the community center. The building, where he'd made his doomed appeal to the HOA board just weeks earlier, was directly in the path of the debris flow. The mud and rocks hit the north side of the structure with tremendous force, pushing in walls and shattering windows. The parking lot, where Karen had parked her pristine SUV for countless board meetings, disappeared under tons of muddy debris. Street lamps bent and snapped like twigs. The carefully manicured landscaping that Karen had insisted was so important to property values was buried under a brown tide of destruction. Then Marcus saw something that made his heart stop. Karen's SUV was in the parking lot, partially buried under mud, but still recognizable. She was at the community center, possibly trapped inside the building. "There's someone in the building," Marcus told the dispatcher. "I can see a vehicle in the parking lot. Someone's trapped." Without thinking, Marcus grabbed his emergency kit and ran out into the storm. The rain was still falling, but the worst of the landslide had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by devastation. He picked his way carefully across the debris field, using his flashlight to navigate around boulders and fallen trees. The community center was a disaster zone. The north wall had been pushed inward by the force of the slide, and mud flowed through the shattered windows like a brown river. Marcus called out as he approached the building, hoping to hear a response from inside. "Help, someone help me." The voice was faint but unmistakable. Karen was alive, trapped somewhere inside the building. Marcus forced his way through the damaged entrance, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was a maze of fallen ceiling tiles, overturned furniture, and ankle-deep mud. He followed the sound of Karen's voice, calling out to let her know help was coming. He found her in the main conference room, trapped behind an overturned table that had been wedged against the wall by the force of the mudslide. She was covered in dirt and clearly shaken, but appeared to be uninjured. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you hurt?" Marcus asked, setting down his flashlight and examining the debris that had her pinned. Karen looked up at him with an expression of shock and disbelief. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" "I saw your car in the parking lot," he replied, bracing himself against the table. "I'm going to try to move this table so you can get out." It took several minutes of careful maneuvering, but Marcus managed to shift the table enough for Karen to crawl free. She was shaking, whether from cold or shock. He couldn't tell. "The whole building started shaking," she said as Marcus helped her to her feet. "I heard this terrible roar, and then the walls just gave way. I thought I was going to die." Marcus guided her carefully through the debris toward the exit. "We need to get you out of here. The building might not be stable." As they picked their way through the wreckage, Karen kept looking around in bewilderment. "I don't understand what happened. How did this happen?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. They were both focused on getting safely out of the damaged building. But as they emerged into the storm, Karen's question hung in the air between them. Emergency vehicles were beginning to arrive, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Paramedics rushed to check on Karen, while fire department personnel began assessing the damage to the community center. "How did you know to come look for me?" Karen asked as the paramedics examined her for injuries. Marcus looked at her. This woman who had dismissed his warnings, destroyed his safety measures, and called him melodramatic. "I saw your car in the parking lot. I couldn't just leave you trapped." "But how did you know this was going to happen?" she pressed. "How did you know there would be a landslide?" "I tried to tell you," Marcus said quietly. "I showed you the geological surveys, the engineering reports, the historical data. I explained why the retaining wall was necessary. You called it fear-mongering." The full implications of his words seemed to hit Karen like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and she looked back at the destroyed community center with new understanding. "The wall," she whispered. "Your wall would have prevented this." The wall was designed to redirect water flow and provide lateral support to the slope. Marcus explained, "Without it, the soil became saturated and unstable. The landslide followed the exact path I predicted when I designed the wall." Karen stared at him, the magnitude of her error finally sinking in. "I almost died because I made you tear down your wall. You almost died because you refused to listen to a professional engineer's safety assessment, Marcus corrected. The wall was never about aesthetics or property values. It was about preventing exactly what happened here tonight. Over the next few hours, as dawn broke over the devastated landscape, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The landslide had damaged or destroyed 5 buildings, including the community center and 2 residential homes. The Martinez family's house had been partially buried, though fortunately, they had been visiting relatives and weren't home when the slide occurred. Mrs. Patterson's basement had been completely flooded, and the foundation had been damaged beyond repair. The elderly woman stood in her backyard, looking at the destruction with tears in her eyes. "My house is ruined," she said to Marcus as he helped her assess the damage. 50 years I've lived here, and now I don't know what I'm going to do." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have fought harder to keep the wall. I should have found a way to make them listen." Mrs. Patterson took his hand with her small, weathered fingers. "Marcus, dear, this isn't your fault. You tried to warn them. You tried to protect us. That woman and her pride caused this mess." As news of the landslide spread, reporters began arriving in Pine Ridge. The story of the HOA that had torn down a safety structure just days before a natural disaster was too compelling to ignore. Local television news crews set up their equipment in the muddy parking lot of the community center, with the destroyed building serving as a dramatic backdrop. Marcus found himself at the center of media attention, something he'd never wanted or expected. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, and reporters knocked on his door at all hours. He tried to decline most of the interviews, but the story seemed to have a life of its own. "Mr. Chen, is it true that you predicted this landslide?" asked a reporter from the local news station. "I identified the risk based on geological surveys and engineering analysis," Marcus replied carefully. "The retaining wall I built was designed to prevent exactly this type of slope failure. And the HOA forced you to tear it down." "The HOA board determined that the wall violated architectural guidelines," Marcus said. "They ordered its removal despite my warnings about the safety risks." The reporter pressed further. "How do you feel about the board's decision now that your predictions have come true?" Marcus looked at the debris field that had once been his peaceful neighborhood. "I feel like we could have prevented this." People lost their homes, their belongings, their sense of security. Mrs. Patterson, who's lived here for 50 years, has to rebuild her entire life at 85 years old. That didn't have to happen. Karen, meanwhile, had gone into hiding. She refused all interview requests and had her phone disconnected, but the media attention was relentless. And it wasn't long before investigative reporters began digging into the HOA's decision-making process. What they found was damning. Karen had received multiple warnings about the slope stability, not just from Marcus, but from city engineers and geological survey teams. She had dismissed all of them, prioritizing aesthetic concerns over safety considerations. More damaging still, reporters discovered that Karen had financial connections to the demolition company that had torn down Marcus's wall. Her brother-in-law owned the contracting business, and the HOA had paid significantly above market rates for the demolition work. The story that emerged was one of corruption, negligence, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked authority. Karen had used her position on the HOA board to channel business to family members while ignoring legitimate safety concerns. The legal consequences began almost immediately. Residents whose properties had been damaged filed lawsuits against the HOA, seeking compensation for their losses. The state attorney general opened an investigation into Karen's financial dealings. The city council launched its own inquiry into how the HOA had been allowed to override safety regulations. Jennifer Walsh, The real estate agent, who had been the lone voice of reason on the HOA board, called Marcus a week after the landslide. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I should have fought harder to support your position. I knew you were right, but I let Karen intimidate me into silence." "You voted to approve my appeal," Marcus reminded her. "You did what you could. It wasn't enough," Jennifer replied. "I should have resigned in protest. I should have gone public with my concerns. Instead, I went along with the majority. And now, people are paying the price." The conversation highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of the entire situation: how easily reasonable people could be silenced by a dominant personality with the wrong priorities. Jennifer wasn't malicious or corrupt. She was simply someone who hadn't found the courage to stand up to Karen's bullying. As the weeks passed, the full scope of Karen's misconduct became clear. Investigators discovered that she had been systematically steering HOA contracts to businesses owned by family members and political allies. The demolition of Marcus's wall was just one example of a pattern of corruption that had been going on for months. The financial damage to the HOA was enormous. Legal settlements with damaged property owners were expected to exceed $2 million. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover the claims, arguing that the organization's negligence had voided their coverage. Karen was eventually arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal negligence. The sight of her being led away in handcuffs made the front page of the local newspaper and provided a satisfying moment of justice for the residents she had failed. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source: the city council, shaken by the landslide and the revelations of HOA corruption, commissioned an independent engineering study of the entire Pine Ridge area. The report, prepared by a team of geological and structural engineers, confirmed every aspect of Marcus's original analysis. The retaining wall, designed and constructed by Marcus Chen, was a professionally executed solution to a well-documented geological hazard. The report concluded. The wall's removal directly contributed to the slope instability that resulted in the October 15th landslide. Had the wall remained in place, the landslide would not have occurred. The report went on to recommend that similar retaining walls be constructed throughout the neighborhood, following Marcus's original design specifications. The City Council voted unanimously to fund the project, using emergency disaster relief funds to pay for the construction. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being hired as the lead engineer for the very project that Karen had tried to prevent. The irony wasn't lost on him as he stood in the ruins of the community center, reviewing construction plans with the city's engineering staff. "Mr. Chen," said the city engineer, "we'd like you to design a comprehensive slope stabilization system for the entire neighborhood, based on your original specifications, but expanded to cover all the high-risk areas." Marcus looked up at the mountainside, where new cracks were already appearing after the recent rains. "It's going to be a major undertaking. We're talking about multiple walls, extensive drainage systems, and ongoing monitoring." "Whatever it takes," the engineer replied. "We can't let this happen again." The construction project took 6 months. Marcus worked closely with the city's engineering department, local contractors, and affected residents to design a system that would protect the neighborhood from future landslides while respecting the natural beauty of the mountain setting. The new retaining walls were works of art as well as engineering. Marcus incorporated natural stone facing, integrated planters, and curved designs that followed the natural contours of the hillside. The result was a system that was both functional and beautiful, proving that safety and aesthetics could coexist. Mrs. Patterson, whose house had been rebuilt with city assistance, was one of the first to see the completed project. She stood in her backyard, looking up at the elegant stone walls that now protected her property. "It's beautiful." "Marcus," she said, tears in her eyes. "I wish my husband could have seen this. He would have been so proud of what you've accomplished. He would have been proud of how the community came together." Marcus replied, "This project succeeded because people were willing to listen to facts and work together toward a common goal." The contrast with Karen's approach couldn't have been more stark. Where she had prioritized control and personal gain, the new community leadership emphasized collaboration and professional expertise. Where she had dismissed safety concerns, the new board made them a top priority. The legal proceedings against Karen dragged on for months, but the outcome was never in doubt. Faced with overwhelming evidence of corruption and negligence, she eventually pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison and ordered her to pay restitution to the damaged property owners. At her sentencing hearing, several Pine Ridge residents spoke about the impact of her decisions. Mrs. Patterson, despite her age and recent trauma, insisted on addressing the court. "Your Honor, I'm 85 years old," she began, her voice shaking but determined. "I've lived through wars, economic depressions, and natural disasters, but I've never seen anything as destructive as one person's arrogance and greed." She turned to look directly at Karen, who sat at the defendant's table with her eyes downcast. "You had a chance to listen to an expert, to prevent a disaster, to protect your neighbors. Instead, you chose to line your pockets and feed your ego. You almost killed me, and you destroyed my home. But worst of all, you betrayed the trust that a community places in its leaders." The judge's sentence was harsh but fair. In addition to the prison time and restitution, Karen was banned from serving on any homeowners association board for life. The message was clear. Community leadership was a privilege, not a right, and that privilege could be permanently revoked. The new HOA board, elected in a special election 6 months after the landslide, was a different organization entirely. Jennifer Walsh, redemption sought and found, was elected president on a platform of transparency and professional expertise. The board's first act was to formally apologize to Marcus and invite him to serve as a permanent engineering consultant. "We want to make sure this never happens again," Jennifer told him during their first meeting. "We want your professional opinion on every structural decision this board makes." Marcus accepted the position, but with conditions. "I'll provide technical expertise, but I won't be involved in political decisions. My job is to assess risks and recommend solutions based on engineering principles, not community politics." "That's exactly what we want," Jennifer replied. "No more politics when it comes to safety. No more aesthetic guidelines that override engineering requirements. If you say something is necessary for safety, we'll make it happen." The transformation of Pine Ridge became a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Urban planning experts, engineering professionals, and community leaders visited the neighborhood to study how it had recovered from the disaster and rebuilt with a focus on safety and sustainability. Marcus found himself speaking at conferences and writing articles about the importance of integrating professional expertise into community governance. His message was simple, but profound safety should never be subordinated to aesthetics, and professional expertise should be respected, not dismissed. The Pine Ridge landslide was entirely preventable, he would tell audiences. The geological risks were well documented, the engineering solutions were proven, and the warning signs were clear. The disaster happened because one person in authority chose to ignore professional advice and prioritize personal preferences over public safety. The story resonated with communities across the country, many of which had their own versions of Karen Whitmore authoritarian leaders who confused personal opinion with professional expertise, Who prioritized control over collaboration? Who saw safety measures as threats to their vision rather than protections for their neighbors? 2 years after the landslide, Marcus stood in his backyard, looking up at the mountain that had once threatened his neighborhood. The retaining walls were invisible from his vantage point, hidden behind carefully planned landscaping that made them appear to be natural features of the hillside. The engineering was perfect, but more importantly, the community was healing. New families had moved into the rebuilt homes. Mrs. Patterson had recovered from her trauma and was once again bringing cookies to new neighbors. The Martinez twins, now teenagers, still rode their bikes through the neighborhood. But now they stopped to chat with Marcus about college plans and career goals. "Mr. Chen," one of them had said recently, "I'm thinking about studying engineering. I want to build things that protect people, like you did." The comment had filled Marcus with a pride that no professional achievement had ever matched. He had saved lives, protected property, and preserved a community. But perhaps most importantly, he had inspired the next generation to value safety over politics, expertise over ego, and community welfare over personal gain. The mountain still loomed over Pine Ridge, massive and eternal, but it no longer posed a threat to the residents below. The retaining walls channeled its power safely away from homes and families, working with natural forces rather than against them. It was a perfect metaphor for community leadership, not trying to control nature, but understanding it well enough to live safely within its boundaries. Karen Whitmore had learned that lesson too late, and at too high a cost. But her failures had ultimately strengthened the community, teaching everyone the importance of listening to experts, respecting professional expertise, and putting public safety ahead of personal preferences. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Walsh. "Board meeting tonight. We're reviewing the annual safety inspection report. Your expertise is needed and appreciated." He smiled, pocketing the phone and taking one last look at the peaceful mountainside. The nightmare was over. The community was safe, and the future looked as solid as the engineered walls that protected them all. The mountain's revenge had been swift and devastating, but it had also been just. In trying to destroy a structure designed to protect people, Karen had ultimately destroyed herself. And in the process, she had taught an entire community the most important lesson of all, that safety isn't negotiable, expertise isn't optional, and community leadership requires both humility and wisdom. As Marcus walked back toward his house, he could hear the sound of children playing in the distance, the everyday sounds of a neighborhood at peace. The mountain stood silent and majestic against the evening sky, its power contained and channeled by human engineering and wisdom. It was exactly as it should be.